So what is digital governance, right? And how do you get it? So that's my specialty. I'm going to use an analogy for you all. So a lot of you guys probably work in the marketing department, right? You are part of what I would call the core team, right? So there's lots of different levels of team inside an organization that's working in the digital space or working with content. People who are making rules about things, writing policies about things, trying to establish norms, I say that they're in the core team, right? So there are other people who are not in the core team who are often doing things that you don't like, right? You want them to follow your rules and they're not following them, right? These are what the governance problems are. A lot of times people will call me on the phone and the first thing that they'll say is, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from such and such." And I'll say, "Hi." And they'll say, basically, it's this summarized. I would like you to come into my organization and tell everyone to do what I say. And I'm like, well, okay, let's talk about that a little bit, right? And they'll start talking about things like silos and how decentralized their team is and how they can't establish norms across that. So what digital governance does is create a really good collaboration model for everyone. And the analogy that I like to use, because people like to say things like, you can't get anything creative when you're doing governing things. And that's just not true. It's a lie. I don't know who started it, but it is a lie. You can. So an orchestra, a symphony orchestra. Anyone here like to go to the symphony besides me? Yes, good, it's fun. Would you argue that they do creative work that moves you emotionally and can be very, very evocative? Okay, so I'm a jazz musician, so I like to do improvisational jazz, right? And so that's also very evocative. One of them feels maybe a little bit more creative than the other, right? But all of these types of groups, like a symphony orchestra, they all operate off of governing principles and norms, right? For a jazz ensemble, they have a lead sheet that has a chord progression that everyone's following and improvising over. It has meter, it has time signature, right? For symphony orchestra, which is probably more akin to some of the larger organizations, they have sets of instruments. And within that, they have a score, right, that they play, and they play a certain line. If you're anyone here a string player, they have bowing strategies, right? So that, you ever noticed all the bows go up and down at the same time? Somebody planned that. It just didn't happen accidentally. So they have to have this orchestrated method, and there's somebody who conducts. So there's all types of artifacts that are in place that helps everyone work together. But everyone doesn't have the same job. Everyone's not doing the exact same thing. So if you want to think about a governance framework, think of it in that way. It's something that's going to help you all work together and enable people to do whatever job it is they're supposed to do, the way that they're supposed to do it, so that you can realize like a shared joint outcome, right? You have a shared outcome, whether that's we want a cohesive content strategy that's well executed, right? Or we don't. We want a slightly decentralized one. Governance does not have to mean doing everything all the same way. Right? That's not what it is. So, good collaboration. Here's another example that is near and dear to my heart. There was somebody who was worked with NASA who was in our group yesterday. There's another example of teams that work together to do something really, really complicated. You know, the example everyone likes to use is, you know, getting to the moon. One of the U.S.'s finest moments. Hubble Space Telescope, which I live in Baltimore, so I'm around all these sort of NASA types of people. There's really exquisite work that NASA does. It's really quite complex, right? And so they have to have a shared goal. They have to have shared standards. There have to be plans. It doesn't mean that there can't be really beautiful things that come out of it, like what was that video? The Space Oddity video that the astronaut did. I think he was Canadian. That's really cool, right? But all of those things, so lots of spontaneity can come out of form and structure as well. So here's the thing. So why are you in a mess in the first place? Is there anyone here that feels like they have a really great set of standards around content that everybody follows, and you have no problem having that happen consistently? Anybody? One? Okay. Anyone wish they did? Okay, there you go. So let me tell you how stuff goes wrong, and this can apply to anything, can apply to any digital channel, anywhere that you can think of. You think of something new, like social software and social media, or websites, or mobile applications, which are usually the three strongest use cases, but it can really be anything, any type of initiative in the organization. Someone has a eureka moment. They buy a URL, So I started doing this work in 1994 and a half, right? Somebody, weird person in a company buys a URL and they put up a website. They start doing things, right? After they start doing things for a while and it starts to catch on, other people in the organization go, oh, wow, that's really cool. That's really great. When I was at Cisco Systems, the cool thing that they figured out was e-commerce. And so not only did people within Cisco Systems continue to do e-commerce, everyone else wanted to do e-commerce, right? So, but what happens at that point, which is that sort of peak from the launch, is if you actually have something that you want to do and you want to repeat inside your organization, at that point, you really should start thinking about documenting how you do that work and creating norms. It doesn't mean you have to write a giant, thick phone book of standards about things, but you might want to start thinking about alignment. Right? If you don't, I was telling folks yesterday, you'll get this kind of, oh, this isn't the mic. You get this sort of thing where, you got two parallel lines, or three or four, and they're skewed just a tiny bit, right? So pretend that that's this is the content strategy that's supposed to be the one that's happening. This is the content strategy that other group that you hate is doing. And then you add time. And eventually it goes like that. Then multiply that by how many groups, how many lines of businesses, how many countries. That's how stuff goes wrong. And that's how you fall into that chaos pit of confusion. And then multiply that by channels, right? So it's no wonder that things are messed up. So the job of digital governance is to pull things out of the chaos and get you into a basic state of management so that you know how to run things. You understand what you're doing, who's doing what, and you start to establish some rules and norms. It's not the job of digital governance to try and stifle creativity. In reality, you're actually trying to get rid of the noise in the system so that people can be creative, right? A lot of times people feel that having norms doesn't kind of stifles freedom of expression. And I like to say to them, well, yeah, it does. But usually a corporate website is actually not a place where you're supposed to be having freedom of expression. You're supposed to be expressing things in lines with standards that meet a business goal. Those are different things. Now, if being a free-for-all meets that goal, then you do that. But for most businesses I know work with, they don't do that. So you've gotten yourself to basic management. You know who's touching what it is. You have rules for it. You've communicated those rules effectively to people. You have a strategy. Most organizations don't. They don't have a digital strategy. They don't have a content strategy. Or if they have one, it's not particularly well communicated, or it's tactical. It's not really linked to the business mission. And so it's not taken seriously by executives because it's got a tactical nature. But pretend you fixed all of that. The next step is you want to be responsive, right? And responsive means that responsive puts me out of a job because it means all of this digital new stuff, or whatever it is so integrated with the rest of the organization that it disappears. So when the organization decides to do a new initiative, it's not as if digital's lagging 6 months behind it. Or maybe digital's the one that's actually forcing things. So you have this sort of cohesive, smooth thing that's working together. And that's really what I'm aiming for when I'm working with organizations, not to create a new silo of people over here doing this, but to sort of push things together better so that everything's working together. Digital 20 years in is surprisingly still relatively immature in the enterprise. I honestly thought, I started my business in 1999, and I thought maximum it would be 10 years. And everybody would be like, wow, they'd have it all straightened out. But it's not. It's really, really hard for people to change the way that they work, right? And it's really, really hard to turn a very large ship that's laden with 100,000 people or 8,000 people or 50,000 people. And it's really, really hard to turn that ship when the ship is profitable enough. Right? So all this great opportunity you're talking to people about what content can do and what it cannot do, maybe they don't care so much. So it's very, very hard. And so governance sort of helps to move that. So there's really 4 steps, and then I'll let you guys talk with Scott. There's really four things that you want to do when you're putting together a framework, and 4 things that you really want to address. One of them has to do with sort of that orchestra piece, which is organize your team. And so when I mention a team, there are really 4 different aspects that I'm looking at. One of them is the core, and the core team, by definition, is the team, part of the team that makes the rules. Right? Somebody's got to say, this is how we do it. Right? That's your core team. The distributed team are the group of people that, if you're in the core team, annoy you, because they're usually a group of makers, and they're out in the lines of business, they're out in various geographies, they're really closer to the ground, closer to the customer base. They're making a lot of things, right? But they have to follow the policies and standards that are established by the core. Okay, that's the part that's usually broken right there, right? So that piece right there. Then you have working groups and councils. People love to talk about silos, right? So silos are good. Only place you're going to hear someone say that. People have to work in silos. There's no way you can't not work in silos. Groups can be too big to get any real work done. But they have to be connected by a shared mission, right? And so horizontal collaborative groups at the executive level, at the working level, and sort of at the big community level around what you're doing around your project, whether it's content or the whole digital footprint, that's essential. And the two most essential ones are the one in the middle, which is at working group level, the people who are hands-on making the rules and really doing stuff, sort of the meat and potatoes group, and the other one is that executive level. There's very seldom alignment around what's happening in digital at that executive level. It's not taken very seriously, and it needs to be really matured. But you need that to cut across the silos and bring everything together. And then the last level of team is your extended team, and those are your external vendors, which for some companies, that's a lot, because some companies outsource almost everything. So if you don't have an understanding of who those people are, then you can't talk to them. And if you can't talk to them, you can't bring anything into alignment. So that's step number one. Step number two is figuring out who's supposed to make the strategy and have the vision for what you're supposed to be doing. And that's not just, we're going to make some artifacts like this. This is really linking the work that you're doing to business outcomes. This is a shortcoming with content marketers and content strategists, right? Which is making that viable connection between the bottom line, and I don't care if you're in a nonprofit or whatever, and the work that you're doing. If you bring those two things together, I'm not saying it's easy, you will find that you'll be taken seriously in sort of your requests for headcount and requests for resources. So having that strategy, making that strategy truly strategic. The third piece is who decides what you can and cannot do. So that's policy, right? Policy is boring. Policy is usually IT telling you what you can and cannot do, but it's also branding policy, right? And so policy protects the organization from risks and creates opportunity for the organization. The fourth one is standards, right? And that's the nature of what you're making. And that, everyone's all over that one, right? Editorial standards and all of that kind of stuff. And the standards protect what you're making and keep the quality. So that's the difference between policies and standards. Policies are creating opportunity for the organization and protecting the organization from things like getting sued, right? Standards protect what you're making. It raises the quality of your making. So if you're wondering between those two things, that's the difference. If you know who does all of these things inside your organization, then you have a clear digital governance framework. Most organizations don't. They haven't taken the time to do this. So what happens is you end up fighting project by project over who gets to decide stuff. You have an individual piece of content, and then you argue about, should it read like this or should it read like you have no idea who's supposed to make those decisions. And so that's really what the power of the framework is, helping you to understand who the decision makers are in the organization and having clarity about those things.